Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive from MTGGoldfish.com, and we're here today to talk about building your very first Magic deck. One of the awesome aspects of Magic Arena is almost as soon as you start playing, you unlock 15 pre-constructed decks featuring a bunch of different cards and playstyles. And while these decks should keep you busy for a while, sooner or later, you might want to start building your own decks out of the cards in your collection, and that's our topic for today. While building your own deck might seem simple, like you can kind of just toss together 60 sweet cards, put in some lands to make sure you can actually play your sweet cards, and you're good to go, this is only sort of true. Making a functional deck is actually a bit trickier. So how do you build your first deck? What are some tips and tricks to help make sure that your deck works the way you want it to? Here are the important things to keep in mind when you sit down to build your very first deck. So when you build a deck in Magic, you need a mixture of lands so you can cast your spells, and also spells to cast. And when you first start building decks, it's tempting to cut back on the number of lands that you play, so you can put more sweet creatures and more fun spells in your deck. But in the end, this often leads to problems, since if you don't draw enough of your lands, you won't have the mana you need to cast your sweet creatures and fun spells anyway. So on Magic Arena, when you go to build a deck, you'll see it automatically recommends 24 lands, which is actually a pretty good baseline for most decks. Most Magic decks are going to run somewhere between 22 and 26 lands. So if you're first starting out building decks, it's probably best to start with the 24 lands that Magic Arena recommends, and then adjust based on the curve of your deck. We'll talk more about curve in a minute, but as you can see, a deck like Mono Red Aggro, which plays mostly 1 mana, 2 mana, and 3 mana spells, might actually play less lands. As little as 22 lands is probably about as low as you can go. On the other hand, if you're playing a deck with higher mana cost cards, 5 mana cards, 6 mana cards, and card draw effects to help you find more cards, you might go as high as 26 lands or 25 lands, as you can see with this Jeskai control deck. And there's a really cool trick here on Magic Arena that if you click this see more details above where your deck is, it'll actually tell you exactly how many lands are in your deck. So as you can see, this Jeskai control deck has 25 lands. If we jump back to the Mono Red Aggro deck, you can see 22 lands. So my recommendation would be, if you're building your first deck, start with the recommended 24 lands, and then if you find that you're playing a lot of 1 and 2 mana cards, you can adjust down from there as low as 22. If you find you're playing a lot of 5 mana and 6 mana and other high converted mana cost cards, then you can adjust up all the way to 26 lands is probably the maximum, but keep it somewhere in that range, and 24 is a great baseline starting point for most decks. So in Magic, there are a lot of different ways of winning the game and defeating your opponent, but by far the most common way is creatures, which means making sure your deck has enough creatures is very important. While there are exceptions, like occasionally you'll see a control deck that's built mostly around spells and has very few creatures, and again, you can use this more details button to see exactly how many creatures are in one of your decks. In general, a huge percentage of the decks in Standard are going to play somewhere between 20 to 25 creatures. That's kind of the normal range for most decks, which means if you consider your deck needs about 24 lands that we were just talking about, you'll have maybe 10 or 15 extra spots in your deck where you can play kind of whatever you want. Removal spells to deal with your opponent's creatures, maybe card draw spells to make sure your hand is always full, fun planeswalkers or artifacts or enchantments. But you need to make sure you have enough creatures, because there's a risk if your deck doesn't play enough creatures that you will end up not being able to deal with your opponent. You'll just be stuck kind of spinning your wheels and drawing cards and doing things, but never be able to actually win the game by killing your opponent. There's also a risk if you play too many creatures and not enough other spells, you won't be able to deal with your opponent's powerful creatures. So having some slots in your deck devoted to dealing with your opponent's creatures and drawing cards is important as well. It's also worth mentioning that there are a few cards that I would call sneaky creatures. They aren't going to show up as creatures in your deck details. However, the cards actually function like creatures in a game, and probably the best example of this is History of Benalia. So technically, History of Benalia is an enchantment saga, but when it comes into play and on the next turn, you're going to create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. So even though it's technically an enchantment, it really functions like a creature as you're playing the game, which means even though it's not going to show up as a creature in your deck details, it's okay to count these sneaky creatures as creatures in your deck if that's the effect the card has on the game. So the bottom line is, while there are some exceptions you'll run into from time to time, like the control deck that we talked about earlier, in general, you should aim to have about 20 to 25 creatures, which after you put in your 24-ish lands, leaves you maybe 10 or 15 extra cards you can put in your deck to do whatever you want to be doing, dealing with your opponent's creatures, drawing cards, playing fun planeswalkers or artifacts or enchantments, but that's kind of the goal to aim for, 20 to 25 creatures, and you shouldn't have any trouble having enough ways to actually defeat your opponent and win the game. Another important consideration in deck building is your mana curve. And mana curve refers to how expensive each of the spells in your deck are. Magic Arena has this awesome feature in the deck builder that we've been talking about before that lets you see your curve in real time. So actually, you can kind of see it right now. This is 1 mana here, 2 mana, 3 mana, 4 mana, 5 mana, 6 or more mana. But if you click on it, you get an even better breakdown with everything written out right in front of you. So in general, most decks contain a lot of cards that cost between 2 and 4 mana, and you can kind of see this in our Abzan Explorer deck right here, where we have a lot of 2 mana cards, a decent amount of 3 mana cards, somewhat less 4 mana cards, and then only a few cards that cost 5 or more mana, and then no cards that cost 0 or 1 mana. That's a fairly typical mana curve for a deck. While focusing mostly on cards that are between 2 and 4 mana is a good start, it's also important to make sure you don't end up too bunched up at one spot on your mana curve. For example, in theory, you could play 20 cards that cost 4 mana, and most of your deck would still cost between 2 and 4 mana, but your deck isn't going to function very smoothly. So you're really looking for this nice curve that we're seeing demonstrated in these deck lists. So what are you aiming for with your mana curve, outside of staying in that 2 to 4 mana range? And really, it's hard to give any hard or fast rules, but maybe as a general rule, something like 0 to 8 cards that cost 0 or 1 mana, and then maybe 8 to 12 spells that cost 2 mana, 8 to 12 spells that cost 3 mana, maybe 4 to 8 spells that cost 4 mana, and then 0 to 8 spells that cost 5 or more mana is a pretty good curve to aim for most of your decks, because one of the most powerful things you can do in a game of Magic is what they call curve out, which basically means using all of your mana every single turn, because in Magic, if you don't use your mana during a turn cycle, that just goes to waste. You get no advantage out of it. So the best thing you can do in Magic is every single turn use all of your mana and not let any of it go to waste. So if you play a solid mixture of 2 mana, 3 mana, 4 mana, 5 mana spells, every turn you can use all your mana, hopefully, by playing a card that costs the same as the amount of mana you have available. One other consideration is here, kind of like the sneaky creatures we were talking about before, there are cards in Magic that don't have a set mana cost. A good example of this is Banefire. So with Banefire, you need to pay 1 red mana, but then you can pay X generic mana. So in theory, you could spend 2 mana there, you could spend 5 mana there, you could spend 10 mana there. With cards like this, you want to do a little bit of thinking. Like, technically, Banefire counts as a 1 mana cost card by the rules because it only has that 1 red mana symbol. However, if your plan is to cast it for 6 mana or 10 mana, you don't want to count it as a 1 mana spell when you're building your mana curve. Finally, Since most decks don't play very many expensive cards, there's a danger of running out of cards if the game goes long. If you're playing all 2, 3, and 4 mana cards and just a few more expensive cards, eventually you'll play out your entire hand and then you won't have anything to do, which again gets you in that position where your mana is going to waste. And like we were talking about, that's really something to focus on, making sure you have something to do with your mana every turn, because wasting your mana is one of the most devastating things in Magic and one of the easiest ways to lose games. So there are a couple of tricks here that can help you get around this problem. So one of these is to add some cards into your deck that generate card advantage by drawing you cards. So as far as actually drawing cards, an easy example of this is Chemist's Insight. It's a 4 mana blue instant that just says draw 2 cards. So you're trading 1 card in your hand for 2 cards. So you're ending up with an extra card, and then with Chemist's Insight, you can even cast it again from your graveyard with the Jumpstart mechanic. Finally, the last way to do this is to use cards that have abilities that cost mana. These are called mana sinks. So if you have something like the Guildmage cycle from Guilds of Ravnica in your deck and on the battlefield, if you don't have any cards to cast from your hand, you can activate the abilities on these cards and still get value from your mana. So if you don't have any cards, for example, you can pay 6 mana to make a 2/2 green and white Elf Knight token with Vigilance from Conclave Guildmage, or you can pay 4 mana with your League Guildmage to draw a card. So as you're constructing your deck, that's another thing to keep in mind, the possibility of running out of cards, and building your deck in a way that kind of minimizes that drawback, so you can make sure that you keep using all of your mana every single turn. So all in all, when it comes to Curve, the bottom line is you should play mostly cards that cost between 2 mana and 4 mana, and only a few cards that are either cheaper or more expensive than that. And then you should try to make sure you have that good mixture we were talking about of cards within the 2 mana, 3 mana, and 4 mana range, so you're not all clumped up at one of those mana costs. And then try to think about adding a few cards for late in the game, when you might run out of cards in your hand, to draw you more cards, or the mana sinks to let you use your mana even when you have no cards in hand, because letting your mana go to waste is one of the worst things you can do in a game of Magic. Lastly today, wanted to talk a little bit about consistency, which is really important to making a good deck. Good decks are consistent decks, and number one, according to the rules of Magic, you can play any number of cards in your deck as long as you have at least 60. So you can see here, this is a 60 card deck. You can add in as many cards as you want and still have a legal deck. You can play 100 cards, 200 cards. The problem is, even though it might seem like you can make your deck more powerful by adding in more cards, actually the opposite is often true, because the more cards you add to your deck, the less consistent your deck actually becomes. So let's say you're building a deck around a certain card, a card like Dawn of Hope. You want to build a life gain theme deck, and Dawn of Hope is your best card. So you sit down to build this deck, so you search up things that can gain you life on Magic Arena, and you just throw in every card that can gain you life, and you have 100 cards or 200 cards. The problem is, you're not actually going to draw your Dawn of Hope that often. Every card you have more above 60 is going to be less of a chance that you draw your most important and best card, so you make your deck less consistent. Similarly, when you build a Magic deck, you can play up to a maximum of 4 copies of a card in your deck. And while, again, going back to the gain life problem, it might be tempting to play one of each card that can gain you life so you have maximum variety, in reality, your deck's going to be more powerful if you decide on the best life-gaining cards and play 4 of those so you draw the best cards for your deck more often and more consistently. So the best Magic decks are consistent Magic decks. So even though the rules allow you to play more than 60 cards, you should never actually do that. Part of the challenge of building a deck and the fun of building a deck is figuring out those perfect 60 cards and learning to think of your deck as 60 cards and focusing on finding the 60 best cards for whatever deck you're building. It's a lot of the fun and challenge of building a good deck. Speaking of consistency, there are 5 colors in Magic, but especially when you first start out building decks, it's usually a good idea to focus in on just 2 colors. While there have been 3 and 4 and even 5 color decks that have existed throughout Magic's history, building a deck that has lots of colors and making it function is actually very difficult. So it's probably best to consider 3 or more colors, kind of the advanced mode of deck building, and stick to just 2 colors, at least for the first several decks you build. The upside of sticking to just 2 colors is you should be able to cast most of your spells whenever you want to, because your mana is going to be nice and consistent. Let's take this deck for example, a green-black or Golgari deck. This deck has lots of green cards, lots of black cards, but it also has lots of lands that make black mana and lots of lands that make green mana, so you're going to be able to cast all of your stuff without much of a problem. On the other hand, let's say we wanted to add some white cards to our deck. Once we start adding white cards, that also means we're going to have to take away some of our swamps and forests and our dual lands that make green and black mana and add in lands that make white mana, so we're going to end up getting hands that don't really work out well. We're going to have hands where we draw a bunch of white cards, but we don't have any white producing lands to actually cast our white cards. Or we'll have hands where we draw a bunch of lands that make white mana and not be able to cast all of our green and black spells. So for the sake of consistency, it's typically better to stick to 2 colors. Even the decks that the professionals build and play at pro tours and things like that, most of the time you'll find that those decks are 1 or 2 colors. So especially right now, when you're just starting out building decks, try to stick to 2 colors. There's nothing wrong with experimenting with more colors eventually, but it's probably best to save those decks for later once your collection and your deck building skill grows. Anyway, that's all for today. Hopefully this short video will help you down the road to building your very first deck. And I want to say, while mana curves and color combinations and creature ratios and all that stuff is important, the most important thing is that you have a blast while you're building your decks. One of the awesome parts about Magic is, apart from just winning games, deck building gives you a means of self-expression, a way to discover cool new things, synergies, and cards. So while keeping all these tips we talked about today, the creature ratios, playing enough lands, all that stuff is important. The most important tip is to have fun along the way. So even with just the cards you get from the 15 starter decks, there's almost endless possibilities as far as building decks, and that doesn't even include all the other reward cards and booster cards and wild cards you get for playing Magic Arena. So have fun and happy deck building!